So the show basically got trashed, but it's fine because where this musical's headed, Marty, we don't need reviews. Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Joe and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I'm a critic, a pundit, a content creator and a fan based here in the UK, and today I want to talk to you all about the musical, wait for it, Back to the Future. Ow, excuse me. So this show, which started live here in the UK and is still running in the West End at the Adelphi Theatre, has recently driven over to Broadway. I'm joking, they probably flew. But it opened last week at the Winter Garden Theatre on Broadway and the reviews were less than favourable. Which is a big deal anytime it happens in New York. It's not the first time we've seen a slew of negative reviews this year for previous productions like Once Upon a One More Time, which maybe is still open when you're watching this video. Maybe by the time I've edited this, it's already closed. Who's to say? And of course, Bad Cinderella, which closed very quickly earlier this year. But where other shows have been hugely impacted by negative reviews on Broadway, Back to the Future might just be able to survive this. And that's because this is a very different type of show. So there is so much to discuss here. Why is Back to the Future opening in the middle of the summer in the first place? Why did the critics dislike it so much on Broadway? And did it get a similar reception in the West End, where it's continuing to run a few years after it opened? All of this will be discussed in today's video, and we're going to answer the question, why did Broadway hate Back to the Future when the West End loved it? So if you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. There will be many more videos just like this coming very soon, as well as lots more reviews, interviews, features, and everything else you might expect. If you want to see my content before anybody else, click on the link in the description and you can sign up to become one of my channel members. They get early releases of all of my videos, as well as a little bit of additional content. But for now, let's talk about why the Broadway critics hated Back to the Future the musical. So to really understand all of this, we're going to go back in time, topically, and we're going to look at what happened when the show opened in the West End. Now, some outlets reviewed it in Manchester, which was actually pre-pandemic, so the show was meant to come in a lot earlier. We've heard this story many times about many different shows. The world started ending, COVID was a thing, and the West End opening got delayed. But it did eventually open on September 13th, 2021, just under 2 years ago, at the Adelphi Theatre in London. Now, you only need to look at the show's poster in the West End to see that it got 5-star reviews from the Daily Mail, the Metro, and the Telegraph. This is one major difference between Broadway and the West End. Some Broadway outlets will give star ratings, but for the most part, it's not something that's done conventionally in New York, whereas it's a very big thing over here in London. So let's start with the really positive reviews, those that gave it 5 stars. First of all, we have Patrick Marmion for the Daily Mail, and for the sake of journalism, I will actually read the Daily Mail to you today. Apologies in advance if anyone has an adverse health reaction. Here we go. So the first paragraph is talking all about the nostalgia of just going to go and see it. It says, "There's really no other way to put it, folks. This show is a blast from the past. A production that packs more energy than a nuclear reactor." He so wanted to be on the poster with that one. A lot of time spent talking about the cast, talking about Ollie Dobson, as well as Roger Bart and Hugh Coles, both of whom transferred with the show to Broadway. I'm happy to relate it has everything from flashing wheels to popping cool events, blazing tail lights, and the all-important nuclear-powered flux capacitor. He knows that's a box with glowing lights, right? But yeah, get ready for lots of talk about the car. The car is the real star of this show. Not since Priscilla, Queen of the Desert has a vehicle been so important to a musical's success. Alan Silvestri and Glenn Ballard's music relaunches the story as a whole new entity. Pop songs like All Right With Me at the start are sweet and catchy, and although the deafeningly shrill sound levels take some getting used to, originality and pastiche combine in Doc's number, it works. Naturally, Dobson electrifies the prom, playing Johnny B. Goode on guitar, and there's a final incantation of the power of love. You'll notice, and this is pretty reflective of the way that the UK press like to talk about musicals, not a lot of descriptive or analytical comments there about the quality of the score, or the tone of it necessarily, so much as just telling us what songs feature in the show and how they're used. We also had Dominic Cavendish giving it 5 stars for The Telegraph. The clever concept of the original, at once joyously escapist and Jeopardy-filled, entails turning the clock back so that the future-savvy protagonist becomes a surrogate parent to his own unwitting folks. The musical makes a canny song and dance out of his predicament as he wards off his mother's instinctual advances and coaxes his father from inhibition. The numbers don't sound like Grammy winners, still, while there are throwbacks to old Broadway and flash forwards to futuristic beats. In the main, the smartly choreographed songs augment the 50s period outlook. Is it the most sophisticated musical around? No. And it so honours the benign ethos of those 80s blockbuster movies it almost invites further inroads into the canon. Next stop, E.T. I'd watch an E.T. musical, that sounds fun. Puppetry, obviously. Now, Nick Curtis's Evening Standard review, unless I'm just failing to spot it, didn't have a star rating, but it seems pretty positive, which is an achievement from Nick Curtis, who can be difficult to please, especially when it comes to musical theatre. In one of his opening paragraphs, he says, "Did I mention this show is enormous fun? You'll believe a car can fly." Songs in the style of James Brown and 1950s girl groups, Bully Biff's malapropistic number and the zesty anthem Future Boy compensate for weaker tunes, but really the odd duff notes hardly matter. Visually, the show's a treat too, with lots of little in-jokes and exuberant swing-style dance routines, including one that's a flat-out homage to that other 1980s teen classic, Footloose. Happily, the time machine is a triumph for theatrical engineering, instantly recognisable, but with an overhaul and an upgrade. Much like the musical itself, go. Enjoy. Now, it's worth noting, not every critic was so positive here in London. If we go to the Guardian review from Arifa Akbar, this was just a 3-star review. It called it a splashy theatre film mashup with gravity-defying effects, cute quirks, and offbeat gags. And the criticism comes here. Even with the addition of 16 new songs, it seems like a show stuck in time, too uncannily like the original, though there is one functional plot change. The cast appear to imitate their film counterparts, and the show seems like a mashup of theatre and film. It begins with Steven Spielberg-style action movie music, while screens are used in filmic ways, including one rolling down for the end. The graphics alternatively leave us feeling as if we are inside a giant arcade game or a 3D film, but it's a striking integration of forms nonetheless. Despite its inventions and its abundant splashiness, it's an odd mishmash of originality and imitation. I love the word mishmash appearing in a review. The DeLorean remaining its biggest star. So they love the car. This is the through line I'm seeing for all of these reviews. Clive Davis gave it just 2 stars for the Times, but otherwise it seems to have had a slew of 3s. A lot of people falling very much in the middle of the road, very impressed by the things that it managed to achieve on stage. No one piling a huge amount of praise onto the material. People talked about the songs. People said at best they were evocative of the time period that we travelled to. I want to think about what Arifa just said in The Guardian. She called it this combination of theatre and film, and I feel like this is something I've been talking about a lot recently with shows like My Neighbour Totoro and Dirty Dancing. We're really starting to see this new genre of stage entertainment that's not a play, but it's not quite a musical either. Now, Back to the Future more closely resembles a musical because they've added in more songs, the characters use the songs in order to sing their feelings, it behaves like a musical would, but for all intents and purposes the songs are kind of superfluous to the show because that's not really what anyone is going to see. Like a Dirty Dancing, like a My Neighbour Totoro, it's all about how you recreate the iconic visuals, the iconic lines of this show and put those on stage. And for that reason, the added songs have to sort of carefully go around the more iconic moments because people want to see those iconic lines spoken. They don't want to hear them sung. It's the reason why Pretty Woman, the musical, doesn't have Vivian singing Big Mistake Huge, even though dramaturgically that would make the most sense because it's the high point of that scene emotionally. Instead, she sings a song, she stops the song in order to say the iconic lines so everyone can be like, yay, she said the thing, and then she starts singing again. But Back to the Future, why even make it a musical in the first place if people aren't really caring about the songs, if people are only going to see the car on stage and to hear the line readings and see those characters again? Why does it need to be a musical? Well, if it was just Back to the Future on stage, people would question why they need to go in the first place. They'd say, I have the film, we can stream it online, I have the DVD. We don't need to go see this on stage, but Back to the Future, the musical, feels like an embellished version that people are willing to spend money on. And there are a lot of people who are genuinely excited about going to see a musical adaptation of this, and there are also a lot of people who genuinely enjoy the songs in Back to the Future, the musical. But I think for many people, that's not really what it's about. But in any case, that's what happened. The show opened in the West End to generally favourable reviews, and even those reviews that weren't so kind to it didn't really impact its success because 2 years later, the third cast of the show is about to begin performances. It's doing very well at the Adelphi. So now why don't we go back to the future and find out what happened when Back to the Future opened on Broadway last week. So here we go. I'm on Playbill for the reviews roundup, everybody. They're great for these. Let's go to Jesse Green in the New York Times. Back to the Future review. The DeLorean crash lands on Broadway. The addition of 17 songs turns the 1985 sci-fi classic into a big why musical with a big wow factor. He writes, the musical's book by Bob Gale sticks as close to his 1985 screenplay, written with Robert Zemeckis, the movie's director, as stagecraft and current-day taste permit. Still, you might hope that something in the musical, for instance music, would change the way the material lands. It doesn't. The numbers carried over from the movie and performed by Marty at that high school dance are of course effective as ensemble opportunities, but neither they nor most of the 17 new songs by Alan Silvestri and Glenn Ballard, though tuneful and in a few cases rousing, do anything different from what the movie did anyway. And it's curious to me that that's the expectation here in delivering the stage adaptation of a classic and beloved film, that we're anticipating it doing something different to what the original film did, and that its mark of success isn't how faithfully it's recreated it and how much it's maintained the same ideas. He writes, the inventiveness and surprise of the climactic sequence, we see Doc climbing the crucial clock tower in a hilariously fake layering of live action behind a scrim and animation projected onto it, makes the show's obsessive concern with faithfulness elsewhere feel like a cheap compromise. And yet it's not really that faithful. The movie is carefully balanced in tone, the musical is dialed up uniformly to 88 miles per hour. That the problems of musical adaptation, even when solved, come to define the production, suggests the why problem at its heart. Why, other than the opportunity to rake in a gazillion more dollars, make a musical out of a movie that clearly does not want you to? Still, in this first post-Phantom of the Opera season, I have to admit that the car alone might be worth a ticket. It fills a deep Broadway longing for large objects performing audience flyovers, and like the dear departed arthritic chandelier, may be doing so for the foreseeable future. So here you have a critic calling this a why musical, calling this a pointless adaptation, saying the DeLorean crash lands on Broadway, and in the last line of this review, he suggests that it's probably going to run for a very long time. Now, what I find interesting here is that he's talking about why even bother adapting this? Why make the thing in the first place? With next to no consideration of the fans who might want to see it. I'm going to circle back to that point a little bit later. For now, let's read some other reviews. Deadline says, nothing on stage here measures up to the screen version except the obvious, the live special effects. Most notably a final sequence in which 1955 Doc climbs to the top of the clock tower. We've heard about this already. Variety said, all that dazzle might satisfy film fans looking to relive signature moments, but for others seeking reimaginings more than repeats, Back to the Future will seem more fitting for a theme park than Broadway. This is a criticism I've heard a lot before, that this is considered to be like a theme park musical. And this is not the only show on Broadway that's ever had that accusation leveled against it. People have said the same things about Disney shows in the past. Patti LuPone said something super similar in an interview recently. And if more and more shows are becoming like this, then I understand the criticism. But for a handful of shows to exist to cater to a more commercial market, is that not A, a good thing that Broadway is offering a diverse range of entertainments, and B, a great thing if it means commercial success for a handful of performers, for that production, and for Broadway as a whole? If we're bringing more money into the industry via these theme park productions, then as long as there's still a range of different shows on Broadway, as long as you still have some meaningful plays and some high art new musicals, isn't there enough room for everything to coexist, especially when otherwise there's a bunch of theatres just sitting dark? Like, if Broadway was just one theatre and we could only have one show at a time, I would understand it, but I feel like the theatre district in Manhattan is big enough for multiple shows to coexist. Adam Feldman for Time Out writes, attending Back to the Future the musical is a bit like watching a car crash in slow motion, except for the part about not being able to look away. Now, from what I remember in the past, Time Out have given star ratings for their reviews, but I know that Time Out over here have stopped giving star ratings if it's lower than a 3. So am I to understand that the same thing has happened with this review? Very possibly. So he's describing the plot here, and he finishes by saying, audience members, meanwhile, may long for a device to jump them 2 hours and 40 minutes into the future. This is a pet peeve of mine with reviews, where because a critic who is looking at it in an analytical way and looking for its artistic value makes the sweeping statement that nobody is enjoying themselves, especially when you're going to a show which I can guarantee you had like a rapturous audience response, because just about everything on Broadway does. People will have laughed, people will have applauded, and people will have had a great time, and meanwhile you have a critic in and amongst all of this, looking around, listening to everyone clap and smile and cheer and saying, you know what, These people are hating this. There have been solid Broadway musicals adapted from hit movies, but this heap seems to have been assembled out of parts from previous film-to-stage flops. Bart played a mad scientist in Young Frankenstein, and Likes was a music-loving teen in last season's Almost Famous. Director John Rando tried 80s kitsch in The Wedding Singer. Glenn Ballard, who co-wrote the score, also co-composed The Ghastly Ghost. I like Ghost, and a lot of people like the score for Ghost. Don't act Ghost here, Adam. Like Pretty Woman and Bullets Over Broadway, the script is by the source's original screenwriter, in this case, Bob Gale. And as in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the main attraction is a flying car. I mean, he's worked very hard to pull in all of those different film-on-stage references in the past, but the truth is, his first sentence was the most correct thing there. There have been solid Broadway musicals adapted from hit movies. Even the likes of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Stephen Sondheim have musicalized films. Just because this is something we're seeing done in a more commercial way recently, like with a Legally Blonde, with a Shrek, with a Pretty Woman, with a Mrs. Doubtfire, doesn't mean there isn't a long history of musicals adapted from film. And truthfully, what is the big difference between musicals adapted from film, like, I don't know, Sunset Boulevard and A Little Night Music, and musicals adapted from books, like The Phantom of the Opera, like Les Miserables? If you're going to insist that creativity is limited only to those musicals that have a completely original story, you're going to find you only have a very small selection to choose from. So the last thing he was talking about was the flying car, and he then writes, what no one has remembered to include here is the engine. It's not a real car, Adam. It's on a stage. Back to the Future sputters to a halt whenever an actual song begins. The musical numbers are a series of missed opportunities to deepen characters or situations. And a lot of these reviews are critical of the songs. If we go to Robert Hoffler for the rap, he's written Sylvestrian Ballad's original score is so derivative it gives jukebox musicals a good name. Frank Scheck for The Hollywood Reporter similarly writes, the original songs, as is so often the case with these adaptations, mainly come across as superfluous. And a lot of that comes down to what I was saying before. Audiences expect the iconic moments from the films, and they don't want the songs to get in the way of that. Now, what I find interesting here is the Broadway critics talked a lot more about the score than many of the critics did in London, and I find this to be a key distinction between the way these two bodies of journalists investigate material. On Broadway, the musical is seen with a tremendous amount more respect. They know that musicals are the lifeblood of Broadway, and they are the home of prestigious musical theatre, like Hamilton, Sondheim before, Rodgers and Hammerstein before him. Whereas in London, especially right now, I find we have a great many working professional critics writing for newspapers who review musicals as if they are plays. The play is considered the prestigious thing in London. We have Shakespeare, we have Andrew Lloyd Webber, but he's considered commercial, even by critics, and there aren't a host of other prestigious musical theatre names because he takes up a lot of space. So whenever a new musical opens, it is considered principally for its book. They look at the narrative and the choices made there. The songs are often described in these reviews. They will talk about the style in which the songs are written, but not the value of the lyrics, not about the impact of the lyrics. So as controversial as it may be, I put it to you that a great many of London's leading theatre critics do not know how to review musical theatre. It's a controversial thing for me to say, but oops, I already said it. If only I could go back in time and take it back. Now, not every review was negative. There were a handful of positive reviews. Theatrely said good things about Back to the Future. The Daily Beast called it a night of winning froth, of striking visuals, a few very good performances, and perfectly fine songs. And similarly, though Frank Scheck for The Hollywood Reporter was critical of the songs, he writes, it's a terrifically fun and amusing story that works nearly as well on stage as it did on film. Finally, just because it's always a great read, we have to go to the New York Post and see what Johnny Oleksinski had to say about Back to the Future. He simply writes, Back to the Future, the musical Broadway review. Watch the movie instead. And as tickling as that is, I don't know if anyone is actually weighing those as serious choices. Like, only people who live in central Manhattan are thinking, should we go see that brand new, very expensive Broadway show tonight, or just stream the original version? Like, those are very different activities for 95% of people. It takes an immense amount of privilege to render going to see a Broadway show the kind of last-minute whimsical activity that you could pass off just to pop in a DVD instead. He says the show doesn't have much going for it in the way of tuneful songs, show-stopping dances, or enthralling storytelling, but it does have a star vehicle. That's a clever turn of phrase, I give you that one. He's done a star rating, but it's a 2-star out of 4. So technically, by UK standard, that would fall somewhere between a 2 and a 3. He writes, and I love this, the hot rod is the biggest special effect the Winter Garden has seen since Rocky the Musical plopped a boxing ring in the middle of the orchestra nearly 10 years ago. But Huey Lewis did not sing Power of Car, he sang Power of Love. We have a bloated gizmo nobody asked for that, while enjoyable in parts, parts, and with an embraceable star in Casey Likes as Marty, never justifies its perplexing existence as a stage musical. Reenact the movie, sure, the audience sits there thinking, but please stop singing. Which is more or less what I told you before. The people going to this show will allow the songs, will entertain the songs, but they don't really want them to get in the way of their enjoyment of the film on stage. Johnny goes as far as to say the score by Glenn Ballard of Jagged Little Pill fame is awful whenever it's not borrowing from Alan Silvestri's rousing theme music from the film. You'll note its inferiority when excellent songs from the movie such as Johnny Be Good and Power of Love are performed amid all the modern mediocrity. I can't bring myself to completely disagree with this. I've said this before about the Back to the Future score, but then again the songs barely matter. That's the whole idea of this. So what can we take from all of this? The Broadway reviews were not kind. There were far more negative reviews from major publications than anything either mixed or positive. And that's because at its heart, Back to the Future, a musical which I gave a 5-star review to for everything that it achieves on stage, is not an artful musical adaptation. It's an ingeniously and impressively staged show that incorporates songs in order to tick a marketing box. It can call itself a musical, and therefore people will buy tickets, even though they don't necessarily realise a musical is not what they want to see. And like I said before, musicals matter more on Broadway. The critics also matter more on Broadway. Tickets are very expensive. People visit New York for short periods of time. There are a lot of shows to choose from, and they really want to know what is the good thing, what won the Tony Award, what's the great musical to see, what shows are good right now. So when a critic says this show is not good, that's going to be harmful. Or is it? Let's talk about what all of this might actually mean for Back to the Future on Broadway. So at the time of me filming this, we haven't yet had the grosses for the week following the show's opening and following all of these reviews, but my expectation, ahead of actually finding out, would be that this doesn't dent the car too much. Could I have made a metaphor there about taking the wind out of its tyres? Is that a thing that happens to cars? I don't drive. I don't know what I'm doing here. But even though I just told you that reviews really matter on Broadway and people pay attention to those when picking which shows to go and see, more so than here in the UK, I don't know if the people who would go and see Back to the Future, the musical, are the same people who are really going to pay attention to those reviews. If they're going to see Back to the Future, the musical, it's not because they think it's the great Tony-winning show, it's because they want to see that specifically. Now, a lot of the reason I think Back to the Future has been so successful is it's an iconic franchise. It was this huge series of films that are still very much beloved, but unlike a Star Wars, unlike a Lord of the Rings, unlike a Star Trek, it hasn't been milked for all it's worth. We've had so many subsequent Star Wars movies and remakes and TV adaptations and opportunities to go and immerse yourself in a Star Wars world and theme park things, and I've been corrected in the past for saying Back to the Future has had none of that, because I think there's been like a little bit of a theme park experience, but for the most part, this IP hasn't been mined for years and years of content. Simply put, if you're a Star Wars fan, you've had years of outlets for being a Star Wars fan. You can go back to the cinema and wear your Star Wars t-shirts and celebrate the new movies. Same if you're a Jurassic Park fan, but if you're a Back to the Future fan, you haven't been able to bask in your love of Back to the Future without just watching the originals again since they came out. This is one of the first things that's really capitalizing on the success and love of those films, and that's a big part of why people are going to go and see it on stage. All of which asks the question, have the critics missed the mark here on both sides of the Atlantic? I'm a firm believer that when you review a show, you have to review it in line with its own objectives. What is it that this show is trying to achieve? What are its goals? What is the metric by which it ought to be judged? And if we really look at this emerging third genre of theatre, not quite a play, not quite a musical, but a film recreated on stage, then that would give us a little bit more clarity in knowing how to review it, because you have critics who have simultaneously praised the show for how faithfully it recreates the film, while others alongside them have criticised it for just recreating the film. Meanwhile, audiences are thrilled that it recreates the film, because spoiler alert, that's what they're going there for. If it was completely unfamiliar and completely changed the plot and excised a whole load of material, then people would be leaving disappointed. Meanwhile, the critics get to celebrate it and call it an artistic success, and it closes a few months later. Instead, we have these two groups completely at odds with each other. The audiences going to see a show and the critics telling them it's awful and they're having a horrible time while they leave the theatre smiling and clapping. Simply put, if the show is trying to recreate the film as faithfully as possible on stage while providing thrilling visuals and not necessarily the most intelligent or brilliant score ever written? And if that's what the fans want, then who are the critics to tell them it's doing it wrong? But those have been my thoughts about the reviews of Back to the Future on Broadway. There's actually so much more that we could say about this. Feel free to continue the conversation down in the comments section. What do you think about the show? What do you think about the critical reception it's had on either side of the Atlantic? Do you think it's going to go on to be successful on Broadway? Before I leave you, I did just remember that I said in my opening we were going to address why it's opening in the summer. And when shows open in the summer like this, often it means they're not too concerned about the awards season. You will see many shows opening on Broadway in the 6 weeks before the Tony Awards deadline, so that they have the momentum of great reviews and having just opened, and they will be fresher in the minds of Tony voters. When something has opened months and months before, it's less likely to be nominated for the big awards. So if we look ahead to awards season, the show might be coveting a couple of nominations, maybe even a win for some of its cast members. Certainly the design elements are deserving of nomination, if not wins, but the show's material and the show itself for Best Musical, I don't know if they're anticipating a Tony win. If I was involved with the show, that's not what I would be anticipating, not in this season. And you might be wondering why I'm saying that, given that it won the Olivier Award for Best New Musical in 2022. Well, that was a very sparse year. In that year, Back to the Future was the closest thing resembling an original score on a UK stage, and it didn't have a wealth of competition. So this idea that it won the Olivier Award because it was beloved over a great many other original and bold new musicals is completely false, because there just weren't that many. We were still emerging from COVID and there weren't that many new musicals to compete with. But I am going to stop myself there. Like I said, there's so much more that we could say about this. I've made a bunch of different points. There's probably more things I meant to say, but I could be here all day. And unfortunately, I don't have a time machine. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to my theatre themed YouTube channel. Feel free to click the link and sign up to become a channel member, and stay tuned for more theatre themed videos coming very soon. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!